How many times has kindness been mistaken for weakness? Grace knew what people would think. She had seen that look before. The squint of disbelief, the tilted head, the quiet scoff that said more than words ever could. But that morning, as she wrapped her lunch in a soft cloth and tucked it into her purse, she wasn't thinking about being seen. She was thinking about hunger. Not just the kind that curls in your stomach, but the deeper one. The hunger that lives in the heart when the world stops caring. The streets were busy, buzzing with people who barely looked up from their phones. Cars passed, music thumping, lives rushing forward. Grace walked slowly. Her shoes were old but clean, and her long gray skirt swayed with each step. Her eyes searched. Not for danger, not for beauty, but for someone she had seen the day before. A man slumped near the bakery, motionless but breathing. His name was David, though no one on that street would have guessed it. To them, he was just another shape on the sidewalk, another reminder of something they didn't want to see. He had been a man of means once. A house, a business, a marriage. But pride is a quiet destroyer, and greed makes promises it never keeps. David had lost everything, not in a storm, but in a slow, silent erosion of what mattered most. When Grace reached him, he was sitting against the wall, his eyes half closed. She knelt without hesitation. Her knees touched the rough concrete as if it were sacred. She opened the cloth, revealing a sandwich, an apple, and a piece of cake wrapped in napkin. She broke the sandwich in two and offered half to him. David looked at her like she was a hallucination. He blinked, then stared. His hands were shaking as he took the bread. "You don't have to," he whispered. "I know," she said simply. Around them, people began to notice. A few laughed. One young man pulled out his phone and started filming. "Check this out," he said to no one in particular. "She's feeding a bum like it's Thanksgiving." Laughter, snickering. A car slowed and a horn beeped in mockery. But Grace didn't react. Her back was straight. Her hands were steady. She looked at David the way you'd look at someone who used to be your brother, someone who had just forgotten who he was. They ate in silence. The apple she split. The cake she let him keep. And when it was over, she reached into her bag and took out a small napkin. She gently wiped his hands, then his mouth. Not like a mother, like an equal, like a friend. "Thank you," he said, eyes brimming. She only nodded. "It's just bread," she said. But they both knew it wasn't. When she stood, her legs trembled slightly. She had arthritis and the ground wasn't kind. David tried to help her, but she waved him off gently. "You've done enough," she smiled. She walked away, not looking back. Behind her, the camera kept rolling. Online, the clip would soon explode. "Crazy woman feeds filthy hobo." That's what they'd call it. In group chats, people would laugh. On comment sections, strangers would argue. But Grace didn't have social media. She had scars. At home, her daughters were waiting. Grown women, both with jobs, families, and opinions sharper than knives. "You gave away your lunch? Again? Mama, you can't keep doing this. People take advantage. No one asked you to be a saint." Grace didn't argue. She just sat at the kitchen table and folded the empty cloth. "I used to be hungry," she said softly. "Really hungry. The kind that makes you forget your name." Her daughters sighed. One rolled her eyes. The other shook her head and turned on the TV. That night, Grace knelt beside her bed. Her knees ached, but she stayed there. She prayed for the man whose name she didn't yet know. She prayed for the people who laughed. And she prayed for her own heart, that it would not grow bitter in a world that made compassion feel foolish. The next day, David was gone. She looked for him for weeks. She asked at the bakery, at the church nearby, even at the soup kitchen, but no one had seen him. In her quiet moments, Grace feared the worst. Maybe he had given up. Maybe the street had taken him, or maybe, just maybe, something had changed. She kept praying. Months passed. Then one morning, sitting by her window, she read the local paper, a small headline buried beneath the noise. "New shelter opens downtown. House of New Beginnings. Offers second chances." The article mentioned a mysterious benefactor, a man who had once lived on the streets, a man who had been saved by a simple act of kindness. Grace's heart skipped. The name of the shelter made her cry. She folded the paper, held it to her chest, and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." She would go, not to be recognized, not for applause, just to see what God had done with one piece of bread, and deep in her spirit she knew this was only the beginning. The video spread faster than Grace could have imagined. She didn't even know it existed until the whispers reached her ears at the grocery store. 2 aisles away, a pair of teenagers chuckled while holding up their phones. "It's that lady," one said, nudging the other. "The one from the video. The bread woman." Grace didn't look. She simply held her basket tighter and walked away. But her heart, steady as it had learned to be, stung like a child's scraped knee. The video, no longer just pixels, had become a mirror, but not one that showed truth. It reflected only judgment. Judgment wrapped in sarcasm, wrapped in the false armor of modern cleverness. At home, her daughters had already seen it. "Mama, what were you thinking?" asked Rachel, the older one. She stood in the kitchen like a prosecutor. "Do you even realize what they're saying about you online?" Grace looked at her hands. "I fed a hungry man." "That's not the point," Rachel snapped. "They're laughing at you, calling you naive, crazy, a woman who throws away her food for garbage." Grace didn't flinch. It wasn't garbage to him. Emily, the younger daughter, joined in. "We know your heart, Mama, but the world isn't kind. You made yourself a target, and it's not just you. People are talking about our family now. My kids saw it at school." Grace sighed, not because she didn't care, but because she did. She hated to see her girls hurt. But there was a deeper ache. The ache of knowing that even her own daughters couldn't yet see what she had seen in that moment on the street. Later that night, she sat alone in her room, the glow of the lamp brushing against the pages of her Bible. She didn't open it to any verse in particular. She just held it, like a memory, like a promise. Down the hall, her daughters were still arguing. Grace could hear fragments. Embarrassing, reckless, poor judgment. But her mind returned to the eyes of the man she had fed, David, the way he had looked at her, not with entitlement, but with a kind of reverence, a look she hadn't seen in years, not since her husband died. Grace had loved once, deeply, fiercely. Her husband, William, had been a quiet man with strong hands and a soft voice. He had taught her that dignity was not in possessions, but in presence. When he passed, it wasn't just his body that left. It was the steady sense of being seen, of being heard, of being cherished not for what she gave, but for who she was. And now this moment with David, the bread, the silence, the thanks, had stirred something long buried. But the world didn't understand such things. The world had forgotten how to sit in silence and see someone's soul. The world preferred captions and clicks. A week passed. Everywhere Grace went, people stared. Some smiled nervously. Others avoided her entirely. The video, still circulating, had reached national attention. A popular talk show host had even played it, laughing at the angel of the streets and calling it a reminder that not all saints live in churches. It was meant as a compliment, but it cut deep. Because Grace didn't want to be a saint. She just wanted to be someone who noticed the unnoticed. One afternoon, at church, the pastor paused his sermon to address the growing attention. "Let us remember," he said carefully, "that good intentions must be guided by wisdom." And though he never mentioned her by name, the entire congregation turned to look at Grace. She sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her heart aching with that quiet pain only humiliation can bring. The pain of being misunderstood in public, even when your soul knows it did right. After the service, a few people approached her. Some offered kind words, vague but polite. Others just nodded and moved on. But one woman, an elder named Clara, leaned close and whispered, "Don't let their eyes change your vision. God sees differently." Grace nodded, tears threatening but not falling. She didn't cry often, not because she was strong, but because she had learned that sometimes tears blur the vision we need to carry. That night she found herself walking. No destination, no reason, just steps. She wandered past shuttered stores and dark windows until she stood before the bakery, where it all began. She sat on the same spot on the sidewalk, the place where she had knelt, the place where bread was broken. She closed her eyes and prayed, "Lord, if I was wrong, show me. But if I was right, help me endure the cost." The night was cold. A light drizzle kissed her skin, and in the quiet, in the stillness, Grace felt no answer, only peace. It wasn't the peace of victory. It was the peace of knowing that shame cannot grow roots in a heart watered by purpose. She stood slowly and walked home. But that wasn't the end of it. The next day at the market, an older man, someone she had known in passing for years, approached her with a grocery bag in his hand. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "I saw the video," he said. She braced herself. "But I also saw something else," he continued. "When my brother was dying, I didn't stop. I didn't feed him. I couldn't face him. But you fed a stranger. I don't think I've ever had that kind of courage." Grace's mouth trembled. He gently handed her the bag. "It's just some apples, but thank you." Then he left, head bowed, as if embarrassed by his own honesty. And in that fragile exchange, something shifted, maybe not in the eyes of the world, but in one man's heart. And sometimes, that's how restoration begins, not with applause, but with apples, not with platforms, but with quiet truths passed between trembling hands. Grace walked home that day carrying more than groceries. She carried the weight of misunderstanding and the quiet reward of obedience. Because in heaven's economy, humiliation for the right reasons is never a loss. It's a seed. And Grace was still planting. The memory of his eyes stayed with her. Long after the video had been forgotten by the internet, long after the whispers faded into background noise, Grace still saw them. David's eyes. In her dreams, in her morning stillness, in the pauses between thoughts. That look, not of desperation, not even of hunger. It was gratitude, but not the shallow kind that passes with a thank you. It was something ancient, something that shook the soul awake. Grace didn't know his story, not yet, but she had seen enough of life to recognize a man who carried ruins inside him. That morning when she fed him, something more than bread had been exchanged. It was the first human contact David had allowed himself in weeks. He had been sleeping behind dumpsters and beneath the old overpass where the wind howled like a beast. His clothes were stiff with dirt. His mind, heavy with shame. He hadn't always been that way. There was a time when his name had meaning in the world, when clients shook his hand and his wife kissed his cheek with trust. But pride is deceptive. It grows in silence and steals in increments. David had believed he was in control of his business, his marriage, his future. But control is an illusion, and one by one the pillars of his life crumbled. A betrayal at work, a business partner who siphoned funds, a scandal he couldn't contain. His name, once associated with excellence, became a cautionary tale. Then came the divorce, then the isolation, then the streets. By the time Grace found him, David was no longer trying to survive. He was waiting to disappear. But her act, the kneeling, the offering, the wiping of his mouth, shattered something in him. Not his pride. That had died long ago. But the wall of self-hatred he had built around his heart. Her gentleness made him remember that he had once been kind, once been whole, once believed in something larger than himself. He didn't know her name, but he remembered her face, her voice, and most of all, her eyes. Eyes that did not flinch at his filth. Eyes that did not look through him, but into him. That night, after she left, David didn't return to his usual corner. He wandered, dazed, as if something had cracked open inside him. He ended up at the back steps of a small church. The door was locked, but he sat down anyway. He hadn't prayed in years, hadn't trusted words in even longer, but under the flickering street lamp, with the wind still cold and the world still loud, he whispered, "God, if you still see me, I'm tired." He didn't expect a response, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, as if something was listening, as if someone had waited a long time for him to speak again. For the first time in months, he slept without trembling. The next morning he woke with a strange urge, not to beg, not to hide, but to walk. Somewhere, anywhere. He found a shelter 5 blocks away, run by a pastor and his wife. Nothing fancy, just warm food, clean clothes, and someone who said his name like it still mattered. Over the weeks, David returned. Each day he said a little more. Each time he listened a little longer. One day he stayed after the meal and helped sweep the floor. Another day he helped fix a broken chair. And one Sunday morning, without planning, without pressure, he walked into their chapel and sat in the back. The sermon wasn't eloquent. The music wasn't polished. But when the pastor said, "You are not what you've done. You are not what was done to you," David broke. He wept. Not the tears of a man asking for pity, but the sobs of someone who had been starving for grace and didn't know until it reached him. He stayed after the service. The pastor prayed with him. And that night, David opened a Bible for the first time since childhood. He didn't know where to begin, so he started with the Psalms. And in those ancient lines, he found echoes of himself. Words like broken-hearted, crushed in spirit, forgotten like the dead. But also, the Lord is close. He lifts the humble. He redeems. David was still homeless, still jobless, still marked by a past that would not easily be erased. But something in him had changed. He wasn't invisible anymore. Weeks later, he asked the pastor, "Do you know a woman named Grace?" The man smiled. "There are many." "No, this one fed me, on the street. She prayed with her eyes." The pastor nodded. "Sounds like someone I'd like to meet." David nodded too, but didn't pursue it. He wasn't ready. Not yet. He wanted to find solid ground first. So he stayed. He worked. He learned. He started helping with the outreach programs, distributing meals, listening to stories, remembering names. He didn't speak of his past, but he no longer ran from it either. One morning, a volunteer brought in a box of old clothes. David was sorting through them when he found a soft gray scarf, worn, but clean, familiar. It reminded him of her, of Grace. He held it for a long moment, then folded it gently and set it aside. And in that small, quiet moment, a promise formed in his heart. He would find her again, not as the man she fed, but as the man who had been fed, by her kindness, by God's mercy, by the miracle of being seen. Because sometimes a single look of gratitude can plant the seed of resurrection. And David was beginning to bloom. Grace didn't cry in public. She never had. It wasn't pride. It was habit. A discipline learned through years of being the steady one, the one who didn't fall apart even when everything else did. But that afternoon, walking home from the market, a silence clung to her chest, heavy, like wet fabric. She moved slowly, the city buzzing around her like she didn't belong to it anymore. Cars passed, children laughed, a woman argued on the phone just behind her. Life didn't pause for anyone's ache. As she walked, she clutched a bag with just a few groceries, bread, eggs, tea, but it felt like she was carrying far more. The weight of misunderstanding, the sharp sting of being mocked for something that felt holy. When she opened the door to her home, the quiet welcomed her like an old friend. Not comforting, not hostile, just familiar. Rachel was in the living room, folding laundry. Emily sat on the couch, scrolling her phone, her face set in that flat expression Grace had learned to recognize. Concern, wrapped in frustration. "Did you go back there again?" Rachel asked, not looking up. Grace took off her shoes. "I went to the market." Rachel's hands paused mid-fold. "Mama, I'm fine," Grace replied. But the words came out too soft, too tired. Emily looked up. "You don't have to prove anything, not to anyone. Let people say what they want." Grace gave a small nod. "I'm not trying to prove anything." "Then why keep walking into it?" Rachel's voice was tight. "Why keep letting the world tear you apart like this?" Grace didn't answer. Not right away. She set the groceries down on the counter and stood still for a moment, her eyes on a crack in the wall. It had been there for years, since before William died. No one had fixed it. No one had mentioned it. It was just there, like grief. Finally, she spoke. "Because I remember what it feels like to be invisible." That silenced them both. Grace turned around. Her voice was calm, but it held weight. "Do you know what it's like to be in a room full of people and still feel like you don't exist? To walk down a street and have no one meet your eyes? To give everything to people and wonder if they ever truly saw you?" Rachel looked down. Emily closed her phone. Grace didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "When I saw him, that man, he wasn't asking. He wasn't begging. He was just fading. And something in me knew I couldn't let him disappear without knowing someone saw him. Someone cared, even for a moment." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "I didn't do it to be a hero. I did it because I've been there." Rachel came closer, slowly. She reached for a dish towel and started drying her hands. not looking at her mother. "Mama, I just want you to be safe." Grace smiled, a tired kind of smile. "I am. Even when I'm hurting, I'm held." They didn't argue after that, but the air in the house remained thick, not with anger, but with questions no one knew how to ask. That night, Grace sat by her bedroom window with a cup of tea. The stars were barely visible through the city lights. She watched the street below, the couples walking hand in hand, the solitary man with a backpack, the mother scolding her child gently near the curb. She had always loved watching people, not to judge, just to wonder, to imagine their stories. Her mind drifted to David again. Where was he? Was he safe? Had her small gesture made any difference at all? She remembered his eyes, that impossible depth of pain and softness, the way he held the bread like it was sacred, the silence between them that had spoken more than words. She thought about praying for him again, but the words wouldn't come, not because she had nothing to say, but because her heart had already been speaking for her all day. She simply whispered, "Lord, you know," and then she closed her eyes. The next day was quiet. She cleaned the house, humming a hymn under her breath. She made soup. She organized the linen closet. She took down the old photo albums and spent an hour flipping through pictures she hadn't seen in years. William holding Rachel as a baby, Emily in her Easter dress, smiling with chocolate on her cheek. Their family vacations, small, simple, filled with laughter. She paused on one picture, her and William sitting on a bench, his hand on hers, their faces calm, like they knew who they were and why they loved. Grace held the photo to her chest and let a single tear fall, not out of sorrow but reverence. He had been a good man, and she missed him, but his love had taught her something more permanent than marriage. It had taught her how to see, how to stay soft in a world that tried to make you hard. And that's what she had given David. Not just food, not just a smile. She had given him the eyes of someone who still believed broken things had value. In the evening, she went out back to water the plants. Her garden wasn't much, just a few flowers and some herbs. But it was hers. She knelt beside a small rose bush and ran her fingers through the soil. And there, with dirt under her nails and the quiet of dusk around her, she felt something shift inside her. She wasn't broken. She was planted. And something was beginning to grow. Not fame, not praise, but peace. The kind of peace that doesn't depend on approval. The kind of peace that comes from doing what is right, even when it costs, even when you come home with a heavy heart. Days passed, then weeks, and David was nowhere to be seen. Grace returned to the bakery corner every Tuesday, the same day, the same hour. Not because she expected a miracle, but because hope has a rhythm, and hers beat with quiet persistence. She sat on the same bench across the street. She brought an extra sandwich, just in case. And she prayed, always in silence. Always with that ache only the unseen understand. At first she thought maybe he had simply moved on. Maybe the cold had driven him somewhere warmer. Maybe someone else had helped. Maybe he'd found a shelter, or a relative. Maybe. But as the days stretched into weeks, the hope that had once glowed like a candle now flickered uncertainly. She began to wonder. Had he given up? Had the streets claimed him? Had she offered him bread on his last day alive? It was a thought she could barely sit with. And yet, she did. At night she lay awake in bed, replaying the scene in her mind. The sidewalk, the laughter, his eyes, the silence. She clung to the memory, afraid that if she let it go, so too would go the last connection to a man the world had already forgotten. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the window, Grace sat in her favorite chair with her Bible resting on her lap. She wasn't reading. She was remembering. Her fingers moved across the worn pages like tracing a path back to something steady, and she whispered, "Lord, if I was just a moment of kindness in a longer story, I accept that. But please, please don't let his story end in silence." She felt no thunder in her soul, no divine voice, only a stillness, a heaviness, the sacred weight of grief for someone she'd known for mere minutes, and yet carried like family. The next day she asked at the soup kitchen. No one had seen him. She visited the church on 6th Street. Nothing. She called 2 local shelters. Still nothing. Finally, she went to the police station, not to file a report, but to ask if anyone matching his description had been taken in. The officer behind the desk was kind, but blunt. "Ma'am, we get dozens of cases like that a month. Most move cities. Some don't make it." He offered a soft smile. "But thank you for caring. Not many do." Grace nodded and left. On the sidewalk outside, she stood still, surrounded by people rushing past. And for the first time in years, she felt powerless. She had faced illness, widowhood, loneliness. But this not knowing, was its own kind of sorrow. Because love, even when brief, always longs for closure. That night she didn't light a candle. She didn't pray with words. She simply sat in the dark and let the ache have its way. Sometimes faith looks like fire. Sometimes it looks like ashes. And Grace was learning to sit in the ashes. The days turned colder. Autumn crept in with gray skies and quiet winds. She stopped bringing the extra sandwich, but she kept watching. Not because she expected to see him, but because she needed to believe he hadn't vanished without trace. She watched the people who passed by. The man who always wore the same green scarf. The teenage girl who talked to herself. The couple who never touched hands but always walked in sync. The world was full of hidden stories. And somewhere out there, David's story was still unfolding. She told herself that. She clung to it. And in the silent spaces between meals and chores and errands, she kept whispering the same thing. "Lord, keep him, wherever he is. Keep him." Then, one cold morning, something shifted. She had gone to buy flowers. Something to brighten the house. As she passed the newspaper stand, a headline caught her eye. It wasn't bold. It wasn't meant to draw crowds. But it stopped her heart. "New shelter offers new beginnings. Anonymous donor funds hope for the homeless." She read the article 3 times, her hands trembling. It spoke of a new center downtown. A place not just for food or beds, but for healing, for rebuilding, for redemption. The founder remained unnamed. But a quote at the end made her breath catch. "Sometimes one act of kindness is enough to remind a man that he is still a man." Her knees nearly buckled. She bought the paper and went straight home. At her kitchen table, she read it again and again. The name of the shelter? House of New Beginnings. She closed her eyes and wept, not tears of grief, but of release. He was alive. Somewhere, somehow, David had found his feet again. And her prayer, the one whispered in silence, in longing, in not knowing, had been answered. She folded the paper gently, held it to her chest, and whispered, "Thank you." She didn't need more. Just this. Just knowing that the seed had not died in the dirt, that Grace had bloomed. Even if she never saw the flower herself, she lit a candle that night. Not for mourning, but for the miracle of resurrection. Because sometimes the ones who disappear do so to rise again. Time passed the way it always does. Quietly, without permission. The days grew shorter, the light more golden. Grace moved through her routines with the quiet rhythm of someone who had learned to live in the pauses. Her heart no longer strained with the ache of not knowing. It still missed. It still wondered. But the pain had softened, transformed into a kind of reverence. Every so often she would unfold the article, the one about the shelter. She had cut it out, taped the edges, and kept it in her Bible. Between the pages of Psalm 34, the words, "He is close to the brokenhearted," underlined in pencil, a whisper of memory in ink. She didn't talk about it with Rachel or Emily anymore. Not because they didn't care, but because some things were meant to stay sacred, and not everyone understands the weight of answered prayer. Then one crisp morning, Grace was sipping tea by the window, when something in the paper caught her eye. It was small, tucked in the corner like a footnote in the noise of the world. A classified ad. Volunteers needed, House of New Beginnings, seeking hands that heal, hearts that listen. No flashy design, no bold promises, just an invitation. Grace stared at it for a long time. She traced the words with her eyes as if trying to touch the heart behind them. Then slowly, she folded the page and set it beside her tea. For the rest of the day, she moved through her tasks with an unusual stillness. She swept the porch, watered the garden, folded laundry. But her mind was elsewhere. Every quiet moment pulled her back to that small rectangle of ink. That evening, as she dried the dishes, Rachel noticed. "You're quiet today," she said gently. Grace smiled, her hand still moving over the plates. "Just thinking." "About him?" Grace nodded. "Yes and no. About all of it." Rachel didn't push. She just stood beside her mother and took the next dish. Grace didn't mention the ad. Not yet. Some decisions need time to breathe before being spoken. That night she prayed differently. Not with longing, but with a kind of anticipation. "Lord," she whispered, "if this is a thread you're asking me to follow, give me the courage to pull it." The next morning she called the number listed in the ad. A woman answered, warm, calm, and clear. Grace introduced herself. "I saw your ad," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Oh, wonderful," the woman replied. "We've had a few calls, but not many. Most people think it's too heavy, working with people from the streets." Grace's voice softened. "I don't think it's heavy. I think it's holy." There was a pause on the other end then. "Would you like to come in this week, just to see the space?" "Yes," Grace said. "Yes, I would." They agreed on Friday. When the day came, Grace dressed simply. A soft sweater, a long skirt, the cross necklace William had given her the year before he died. She took the bus downtown, holding a small notebook in her purse. Not because she needed it, but because old habits, like dignity, die slowly. The building was on a quiet street. It wasn't fancy. The sign outside was carved wood weathered by rain with ivy curling around the bottom. House of New Beginnings. She stood in front of it for a moment, breathing in the air, trying to still the flutter in her chest. Then she walked in. The entryway smelled like fresh paint and coffee. A woman with silver hair greeted her with a warm smile. "You must be Grace." Grace nodded. "And you?" "Linda," the woman said. "Come, I'll show you around." The space was small but full of light. A kitchen in the back, a common room with books and worn couches. Upstairs a few simple bedrooms. Each had a cross on the wall. Each had a window that let the light in. Linda explained their mission. "We're not just a shelter. We try to help them rebuild, spiritually, emotionally, practically. We partner with counselors, churches, even some local businesses for training." Grace listened carefully, her eyes absorbing every detail. They stopped in the garden out back. Modest, wild, but alive. "This is my favorite spot," Linda said. "They come here to pray, or cry, or just breathe." Grace looked up at the sky. "It's beautiful," Linda smiled. "Sometimes healing doesn't need walls, just open air." Then she turned to Grace. "Would you like to volunteer?" Grace hesitated for just a breath. Then, "Yes, I would." Linda touched her arm gently. "You don't know how much that means." But Grace wasn't thinking of herself. She was thinking of the man who once held a piece of bread like it was a lifeline. She was thinking of second chances, of redemption, of miracles that begin with small, quiet yeses. As she left that day, walking back to the bus stop, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the sidewalk. Grace didn't rush. She let the wind pass through her, and in the stillness of that moment, she knew God wasn't done. The story was still unfolding. And somewhere within these walls, within this shelter of grace, a reunion was waiting. Quiet, unexpected, divine. A seed she had planted in silence was about to bloom in the open. Friday arrived with a chill in the air, the kind of morning that clings to the skin and whispers memories from decades ago. Grace rose early, as she always did. But this time, there was something different in the way she moved. Her hands were calm, her pace deliberate. She stood by the window longer than usual, watching the world wake. The street was quiet. A single leaf spiraled down from the maple across the road. Everything felt suspended, as if even time was holding its breath. She chose a long, soft coat, navy blue, the same she had worn to William's memorial service. It wasn't grief she carried now, but memory, and something else, something lighter. Anticipation, maybe, or faith. The ride downtown passed in silence. Grace didn't bring a book. She didn't glance at her phone. She simply watched, the cityscape shifting, the strangers entering and exiting with their stories wrapped in their coats. It reminded her that the world is full of invisible battles, and sometimes the smallest kindness is the only shield someone has left. She arrived 10 minutes early. The House of New Beginnings stood quiet and still, bathed in morning light. The carved wooden sign looked older now, softened by weather. It felt lived in, trusted. Grace stepped inside. Linda greeted her at the door. Her smile was gentle, like someone who knew how to speak without saying much. You came, she said. I said I would, Grace answered. And that was all. They walked the same path as before, through the kitchen, past the rooms, into the garden. But today the place felt different. Not just a space for the hurting. It felt like sacred ground. Something had been born here. Lives, stories, healing. Linda handed her a clipboard. You don't have to fill this out now, just some basic info. But I do want to introduce you to someone. Grace followed without question. They turned the corner into the common room. And there, standing by the window, sunlight spilling over his shoulders, was David. Clean-shaven, upright, dressed in jeans and a soft gray sweater. He looked older somehow, not by age, but by depth, as if the man he had been on the street had died, and something stronger had taken his place. He turned. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. For a moment, neither moved. Then David stepped forward, slow and steady, like a man approaching something holy. Grace, he said, voice quiet. She hadn't told him her name. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The article, the same one she had saved. I saw your name in the credits, he said. You were listed as a witness. Grace nodded slowly. I didn't think they'd print it. They did. He smiled. It's how I found you. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sorrow, from completion. You're well, she whispered. I'm whole, he replied. Because you stopped. Because you saw me. Grace stepped closer. It wasn't just me, she said. It was God. David's eyes glistened. I know, but you were his hands that day. They sat. They didn't need to fill the silence. He told her his story. The rise, the fall, the wandering, the cold nights, the voices in his head, the whisper in his soul, the first time he prayed again, the night he found the church steps, the first meal, the first verse, the day he believed he could start again. Grace listened, her hands folded in her lap, her heart still, her eyes never leaving his. Then he paused. I never thought I'd see you again. I didn't think I would see you either, she said softly. But I prayed, he added. So did I, she replied. They smiled. Linda returned with tea. The afternoon stretched gently around them. No rush, no demands. Just the quiet unfolding of something sacred. Two people, once strangers, now woven by grace into the same tapestry. As the sun began to set, David turned to her. I've been thinking, he said. This place, it wasn't just built for people like me. It was built because of people like you. Grace tilted her head. What do you mean? Because you didn't walk away. Because you believed there was still something worth saving. Grace looked down, then up again. Her voice was firm but tender. I didn't see a beggar. I saw a man. And I remembered what it felt like to be invisible. David nodded. And I remembered what it felt like to be seen. A silence settled. Not awkward. Not unfinished. Just full. Then David stood. There's something I'd like to show you. He led her to the hallway near the entrance. There on the wall hung a framed photograph. It was old, grainy, taken from the viral video. A still image of her handing him the bread. His face lifted, hers bowed. The world blurred behind them. Beneath it a plaque read, Where mercy begins, miracles follow. Grace's hand covered her mouth. David stepped beside her. That moment changed everything, he said. For me, for others, for this place. Grace closed her eyes, and in that sacred hush she heard it again, the prayer she had whispered in the dark. Lord, if this was just a moment in a longer story, I accept that. But it wasn't just a moment. It was a seed, and here it was, blooming, right before her eyes. She opened them, took one last breath of that holy air and whispered, Thank you. Not to David, not to Linda, but to the one who had written this story, in the quiet, in the sorrow, in the bread that was broken. Because sometimes, when you follow a thread of grace, it leads you home. Some reunions are loud, tears, laughter, voices rising in surprise. Others arrive in silence, like a whisper returned after a long absence. The day Grace met David again at the House of New Beginnings had felt like that, a sacred stillness wrapped in light. But what followed was not a single moment. It was a slow unfolding, a reunion not only of people, but of stories, of souls that had once crossed for a reason deeper than either understood. They began meeting every Friday, not planned, not announced. Just a rhythm that seemed to emerge from their hearts. David would make the tea. Grace would bring shortbread cookies from a little bakery near her home. They would sit in the back garden, a quiet place filled with rosemary, lavender, and the soft hum of wind. Their conversations didn't need direction. Sometimes they spoke of scripture, sometimes of the weather. Sometimes they simply sat, letting silence do what words couldn't. David told her about the small group he'd started with other men at the shelter, men learning to rebuild their lives. He called it the table. No pulpit, no preaching, just stories, just presence. Just bread passed between them and the belief that what was broken could be shared. Grace listened, moved not by the scale of the work, but by its honesty. "I didn't start it to save anyone," he once said. "I just wanted to give what I received. Someone who didn't look away." Grace smiled. Sometimes that's how God works, through the eyes that stay. And slowly, something else began to grow between them. Not romance at first, but recognition, that sacred sense of being known. One Friday it rained, not a storm, just a quiet, steady downpour that softened the air. They sat beneath the awning, their chairs close, watching the rain kiss the garden. David cleared his throat. "I used to think love was something you earned," he said. "That you had to be good enough, whole enough, useful." Grace didn't interrupt. "But now," he continued, "I think love is what finds you when you're finally honest. When you stop pretending you're not broken." Grace turned to him. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've never met anyone who wasn't broken." Their eyes held, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not a spark, but a warmth, like an ember that had waited patiently beneath the ashes. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. She didn't lean in. She simply let it rest there, his hand over hers. And the rain fell like grace. From that day forward, something shifted. They walked more, talked longer, laughed deeper. He told her of his regrets, the things he had done, the people he had hurt, the apology letters he had written but never mailed. She told him of her loneliness, the way silence felt louder at night, the years she had folded herself small so others wouldn't feel discomforted by her grief. They became, slowly and without force, a place of rest for each other. One evening, David stood at the front of the chapel and gave his testimony. He didn't speak like a man trying to impress, he spoke like someone who had tasted mercy. And at the end he said something that made the room fall still. "I found God again on a sidewalk, in a piece of bread, in a woman who didn't run." People cried, but Grace just closed her eyes, because she knew. She had been seen too. Later they walked outside together. The moon hung low. The street was quiet. David stopped at the steps. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low, "about the future, about purpose, about how we can serve together." Grace turned to him, her heart steady. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why this matters." He reached into his coat, pulled out a small Bible, worn, familiar. It was his mother's, the one he had once thought lost forever. "She gave this to me when I was 13, he said. Said one day it would lead me home. He opened it. Inside was a folded note, newly written. Hand trembled but sincere. "Grace," he read aloud, "I don't want to reward you. I want to honor you. As a woman, as a sister in Christ, as the one who saw me when I had forgotten who I was." He looked up. "I don't know what God has planned, but I know he writes stories with hands like yours." She didn't speak, not out of doubt, but out of reverence, because this wasn't a proposal of romance. It was something deeper, a proposal of mission, of walking side by side into the unknown, not as saviors but as survivors, as witnesses, as those who had sat at the bottom and found each other in the silence. She placed her hand over his heart. "I'm not looking for a title," she said, "just a place to belong." "You already do," he replied. They stood there for a long time, no promises, no guarantees, just grace, and the beginning of something holy. Because sometimes reunions aren't about going back. They're about finally arriving. Together. The seasons shifted. Spring came not with fanfare but with a quiet gentleness. Buds swelled on branches. Rain softened the ground. Birds returned to the trees behind the house of new beginnings. Life resumed in the way only Grace knows how. Slow, persistent, faithful. And within the walls of that small home of healing, something else was blooming. David had changed. Not just outwardly, though he carried himself with the dignity of a man rebuilt, but inwardly. His voice was steadier, his gaze more anchored, and his purpose had found shape. Grace noticed it in the way he moved among the residents, how he stopped to listen, how he remembered names, how he prayed not to be seen but to be useful. Their friendship had grown roots, deep, tangled, nourishing. They didn't speak of it in romantic terms, but there was a nearness between them that no one questioned, a mutual reverence, the kind that forms not from attraction, but from witness, having seen the other at their lowest and stayed. Then came the morning. David arrived early, clutching a folder, his hands visibly worn. He had reviewed every word a dozen times, but still, the nervous energy danced in his fingertips. This wasn't fear, it was hope, pressing against the edges of his chest. Grace was in the kitchen, as always, setting the table for morning tea. He watched her for a moment, the way she laid each cup with care, the way she paused before lighting the small candle in the center, a habit she'd adopted weeks ago. "A flame for those still in the dark," she had said once. He stepped forward. "Grace," she turned. "You're early. I needed to speak with you. Before the others arrive." She gestured to the table. "Sit." He placed the folder between them and took a breath. "I've been praying," he said. Grace nodded. She didn't need more than that to listen with her whole heart. "There's a grant," he continued, "from a network of churches. They support ministries like ours, especially when they show real results. Lives changed. Hope restored." He opened the folder. Inside, a proposal. Typed, neat, passionate. Pages filled with vision, not of expansion, but of multiplication. A new home, a new team, a new wave of possibility. Grace read in silence, her fingers steady as they turned each page. And then she saw it. At the bottom, handwritten in ink slightly smudged from his own palms. Co-founder, Grace Morgan. Her breath caught. She looked up. "You wrote my name." "I did," David said softly. "Because this was never just my calling. You were there when it began. You were the first open door I walked through." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she closed the folder gently and folded her hands in her lap. "David," she said slowly, "I'm not trained. I've never led anything like this. I've never spoken from a platform. I'm not a leader." David reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "You're wrong," he said. "You led me, not with speeches, not with systems, but with mercy." She held his gaze. Her voice was quiet. "I just shared my lunch, and it saved my life," he said. "Grace, leadership doesn't always look like titles. Sometimes it looks like hands that serve, feet that stay, a voice that speaks truth even when it trembles." Tears filled her eyes. "But I'm old," he smiled. "So is faith. So is scripture. So is every single thing that still holds weight in this world." She laughed through the tears, and something loosened in her chest, a knot of doubt that had lived there for years. They sat in silence for a while, not needing to fill it, just letting the presence of the moment settle around them. Finally, Grace spoke. "I need to pray." David nodded. Of course, but in his heart he already knew. So did she. That night, Grace didn't sleep much. She sat by the window with her Bible open across her knees. She read through passages that had carried her before. Isaiah, Psalms, the quiet tenderness of Ruth. She thought of every time she had felt unseen, every time her hands had served and her heart had gone unnoticed. And she thought of the bread, that one small act, the one the world had mocked, the one heaven had blessed. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't know why you keep choosing me, but I won't say no." The next morning, she came to the shelter with a small cross pinned to her collar. David saw it and smiled. "So," Grace met his eyes, "I'm in." And the weight of those two words felt like a beginning. Over the next few weeks, they worked side by side, finalizing documents, drafting plans, praying over every line, every signature. They named the new project The Anchor, because they both knew what it was like to drift, to be pulled under, and what it meant to find something solid again. Not a shelter, a sanctuary, not just a building, A place where people would be reminded that their story wasn't over, that grace wasn't a myth, and that broken things still had worth. One day, as they reviewed the final plans, Grace paused. She looked at David. "There's something I never told you." He leaned in. "That day I gave you the bread, I wasn't just being kind, I was angry, tired. I'd just come from the doctor. Bad news about my knees. I was afraid I'd lose my mobility." David's eyes softened. "I remember how steady you looked." She smiled sadly. "It was a mask. I was afraid of being forgotten. And then I saw you. And I thought, if he's still standing, maybe I can too." He reached for her hand again. And together, they sat in that truth, that sometimes the ones we save are the ones saving us. They submitted the proposal. The answer came back in 8 days. Approved. Fully. Tears flowed freely that day. Not just from them, but from the others, those who had watched their journey, who had been touched by their story, who now saw what God could do with a yes. That night, they gathered in the chapel. David stood at the front, Grace beside him. He spoke with the steadiness of a man who had been shattered and remade. And when he finished, he turned to her. And for the first time, she stepped forward. She didn't speak like a leader. She spoke like a woman who had walked through fire and still carried the scent of heaven on her breath. "When God puts something in your hands," she said, "don't look at the cracks in your fingers. Look at the heart he's using to hold it." The room was still. Then applause. Then weeping. Then joy. And outside the stars burned bright. Because mercy had not just passed through this place. It had made a home. When the doors opened, it wasn't with trumpets or banners. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony. No news crews. No speeches to the crowd. The anchor opened quietly, just as Grace and David had planned. It began on a Monday. Clouds hung low, like heaven leaning in to listen. The garden had been freshly trimmed. The lights in the hallway flickered to life with the flip of a single switch. And in the kitchen, coffee brewed. Not for spectacle, but for comfort. Grace stood at the threshold and breathed in deeply. This wasn't a dream. This was a promise. Fulfilled. Not just to her. Not just to David. But to every soul who had ever stood on a corner feeling forgotten. To every woman who had ever cried in silence, asking God if her life still had purpose. To every man who thought the mistakes of his past had already written the final page of his story. The first to arrive was a woman named Brenda, late 50s. Quiet eyes. Shoulders curved from years of carrying burdens too heavy to name. She said nothing when she entered, just stood in the doorway hesitant. Grace approached slowly, gently. No clipboard, no interview, just presence. "You're safe here," she said softly. Brenda nodded once, then stepped inside. By noon, 5 others had arrived. A young man with a tattoo of a bird across his neck. A couple who had lived in their car for over a year. An older gentleman who didn't speak, but whose eyes clung to every word spoken around him like a child memorizing the world. They didn't know each other, but they knew the language of pain. And when David sat with them in the common room, when Grace brought tea and offered her silent prayer, something holy settled in the space. That evening, Grace stayed behind after the others had gone to bed. She sat in the garden, the same garden she had once walked through as a guest. The wind whispered through the rosemary. David joined her. Neither spoke at first. Then he said, "You feel it too, don't you?" Grace nodded. "It's not just a place." "No," he said. "It's a beginning." She looked at him. The man who had once clung to a piece of bread like it was his last hope now spoke like a builder, like someone who had come back from the edges and brought light with him. "You ever wonder," she asked, "why God chose us?" "All the time. And what do you think?" David's voice was quiet. "Because we had nothing left to protect." Grace thought about that, about how pride had been stripped from them, about how their egos had burned away in the fires of loss, about how sometimes the only way to truly serve is to stop trying to be seen. "You know," she said, "when I first gave you that bread, I didn't think I was changing anyone's life. You were. I was just trying to be kind. And that's exactly what changed it." The stars blinked above them. Simple, ancient, constant. David looked up. "You think he still watches?" "I think he never stopped." More came the next week. Not because of flyers or social media, but because someone had told someone else. There's a place that doesn't just feed your stomach. It feeds your soul. They began to gather on Wednesdays for a shared meal. No preaching, just food, a table, stories. Grace called it dinner with no walls. Everyone sat together, no one above, no one beneath. And around that table, something rare unfolded. Honesty without fear. People cried, laughed, held hands. Sometimes the room went completely still as someone told the truth for the first time in years. And David always closed those nights with the same words. You're not too far. You're not too broken. You're not too late. One evening, after such a meal, Brenda approached Grace. She held out a small note folded tightly. I don't talk much, she said, but I wrote this. Grace took it, read it slowly. The note said, This is the first time in 20 years I've eaten without shame. Thank you. Grace folded it gently, tears in her eyes. No applause, no spotlight. Just mercy doing what mercy does best, quietly restoring the unseen. That same week, a young man named Troy came to them, barely 21, addiction written in the shadows under his eyes. He didn't say much the first time, just sat at the edge of the table listening. But Grace noticed the way his shoulders dropped when David told his story, the way he blinked quickly when a woman shared how she had forgiven herself after 30 years of guilt. After the meal, Grace walked over and handed him a warm muffin wrapped in a napkin. He stared at it. I didn't ask for this, he muttered. I know, Grace said, but maybe God wanted you to have something sweet today. He took it, and the next week, he came back. A week after that, he spoke. A week after that, he cried. And by the time spring was fully in bloom, Troy was volunteering in the kitchen, learning how to make the same muffins. I'm not good at much, he once told Grace. You're good at being here, she said. And that's enough. The anchor became more than a place. It became a rhythm, a sanctuary, a family. People came, stayed, healed. Some left to start over elsewhere, but they always carried the name of the place like a blessing, the anchor. And Grace? She never took a title, never stood behind a podium. She kept pouring tea, lighting candles, listening, holding hands, and praying, always praying, that the next person who walked through the door would feel what she had once needed more than anything, to know they still mattered. David watched her often, not with romantic longing, but with awe, with gratitude, with the quiet reverence of a man who knew he was standing beside a living testimony. One day he asked her, If this is just the beginning, where do we go from here? Grace smiled. Wherever the next broken heart leads us. And they stood there together, not as founders, but as followers, not of plans, but of purpose. Because when God writes a story of redemption, he never uses straight lines, only the paths of the willing. And Grace had never stopped walking. Some prayers are loud. They rise from the gut with trembling hands and desperate cries. Others are quiet, whispered at night, folded into silence, hidden behind everyday acts of faith. But every true prayer, whether shouted or whispered, is heard. Grace had always prayed in silence, not for show, not even for certainty, but because her conversations with God had always been more about presence than petitions. She prayed while washing dishes, while folding laundry, while walking through the garden, fingertips brushing rosemary and mint. Her most sacred prayers weren't long. They were simple, honest. Lord, help me stay soft. Lord, show me how to love. Lord, please use this. And long before she had a title, long before the anchor, Grace had prayed one prayer over and over again. Don't let it all be for nothing. The pain, the loneliness, the loss. She had carried so much for so long, and sometimes it felt like the weight of her life would never produce fruit, only aching. But then came David, and the bread, and the garden, and now the anchor, where broken hearts came to breathe again. On the first anniversary of the home, they held a small gathering, just the residents, a few volunteers, a modest meal, no balloons, no speeches. Grace prepared the soup herself, lentil and carrot, the way her mother had made it when she was young. David baked bread. They set the table together in the backyard under strings of soft yellow lights. Brenda brought fresh flowers. Troy helped set the chairs. And when everyone sat down, something sacred settled over the table. It wasn't just a meal, it was communion, not of ritual, but of remembrance. Every face at that table had been reshaped by grace. Not erased, not perfected, just loved. They held hands before the first spoonful touched lips. No one told them to. It just happened. Naturally, like breath, like gratitude that had finally found its voice. Tears glistened, but no one apologized. Pain was no longer shameful there. It was part of the soil from which their healing had grown. When the meal ended, David stood. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. 1 year ago, he began, this was just a hope in our hearts. We didn't know what we were doing. We just knew what had been done for us. He looked at Grace. She gave me bread. I gave her my story. And God did the rest. Grace lowered her head, emotion catching in her throat. David continued. We thought we were building a place for others. But what we didn't expect was that God was also rebuilding us. He turned to Troy, to Brenda, to the others. Each of you is a stone in this house. Each of you belongs. There were no cheers, no applause, just the soft sound of sniffles, deep breaths, heads bowed in reverence, and the kind of silence that feels like holiness. After the meal, Grace returned to the kitchen alone. She stood at the sink, hands in warm water, looking out the window. The garden was glowing under the soft lights. She could see them all still gathered, laughing gently, hugging, holding space for each other. And she whispered, not to the wind, not to herself, but to the one who had always been listening. Thank you. That was all. No sermon, no list, just 2 words. Because what had begun as a moment on a sidewalk had turned into a movement of mercy. That night, David walked her home. They didn't talk much on the way. The night was cool, the moon high. As they reached her gate, he paused. I know we've said we're just partners in the mission. Grace looked at him, her heart steady. I meant it when I said I didn't come looking for love, she said. I know. And I still believe our work is the heart of this. I do too. A pause. But I've also come to believe, he said slowly, that sometimes love doesn't knock. Sometimes it stays. Quiet, steady, watching, waiting, until the heart is ready. She smiled. Not wide, not in surprise, but with the knowing of a woman who had once believed her story was finished, and now stood at the beginning of another chapter. I'm not young, she said. I'm not looking for young, he replied. I'm looking for true. She stepped forward, took his hand, and for the first time in years, Grace felt that the ache in her chest had a place to rest. Not an ending, but an answer. Because prayers don't always come wrapped in the form we expect. Sometimes they come in folded notes, in warm soup, in calloused hands reaching through grief. Sometimes they look like a man kneeling in the dirt beside a garden bed planting hope. And sometimes they look like a woman who gave bread without expecting it to be multiplied. The next morning, Grace woke early. She sat by the window, tea in hand, Bible in her lap. And as the sun rose, spilling gold across the kitchen tiles, she turned to the Psalms and underlined a verse she had long known by heart. The Lord has heard my cry. He has turned to me. He has lifted me out of the pit. She closed the book, held it to her heart, and smiled, because this was the prayer answered, and it had come not with noise, but in the quiet unfolding of mercy. Later that day, she received a letter, handwritten, no return address, just one line on the paper. Because of you, I tried again. Thank you. A friend. She folded the note, placed it in her Bible, and whispered the same prayer one more time. Lord, please keep using this, because now she understood. The prayer is never really finished. It just changes shape. The world doesn't expect much from the forgotten. It walks past the weary. It dismisses the soft. It underestimates the quiet. It praises strength that shouts, not the strength that kneels. It trusts credentials more than compassion. And so, when God begins to write a story using the overlooked, the world is often too distracted to notice the miracle unfolding in plain sight. But Grace noticed. And so did David. Because they had both lived long enough to know what it meant to be counted out. Grace had once believed that her best days were behind her, that her usefulness had faded with age, with widowhood, with the erosion of dreams she no longer dared to name. And David, once celebrated in boardrooms, once applauded in polished shoes, had learned the bitter truth of pride undone and reputation shattered. They had nothing left to prove. And that was the beginning of everything. The anchor grew, not because of marketing strategies or grand partnerships, but because people saw the truth in it. They saw the way Grace listened without interruption. They saw how David cleaned tables after meals, not because he had to, but because dignity begins with small acts of service. They saw that the unlikely could lead, that the quiet could build, that mercy could multiply. One Sunday afternoon, a young woman named Leela arrived. She was thin, pale. Her eyes darted quickly, always scanning, always bracing for disappointment. She had spent most of her life in the foster system, never rooted, always moving. Grace welcomed her with a soft blanket and a cup of warm tea. "You don't have to talk," she said gently. "Just be." Lila sat in the garden for hours, said nothing, but returned the next day, and the next. Weeks passed before she spoke her first full sentence to Grace. "I never knew silence could be safe," and that became her sacred place. That same month, an older man named Elias came through the door. His past was soaked in regret. A former pastor who had fallen, not in scandal, but in exhaustion. He had burned out, lost his faith, lost his family, lost himself. He thought no church would welcome him again. But the Anchor wasn't a church in the traditional sense. It was a field hospital for the soul. Elias found rest there, and then one day, he asked if he could lead a small devotion. Grace and David said yes, not because of his resume, but because his voice trembled with humility. The first time he spoke, he cried halfway through the verse. No one judged him. They just sat beside him. Because when God restores, he doesn't polish things back to perfection. He makes them holy in their brokenness. One evening, David and Grace sat on the back steps, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. Children from the neighborhood ran by, their laughter trailing through the air. A breeze carried the scent of basil and soil. David turned to Grace. "Do you ever think about how strange this all is?" "All the time," she smiled. "I mean, this started with bread. It started with obedience," she corrected. "The bread was just the vehicle." He nodded. "Why do you think God uses people like us?" She thought for a moment. "Because we don't fight him for the pen." David laughed, not loudly, but deeply. "Because we let him write," she added. "Even when we don't like the page we're on." He leaned back, his hands behind his head. "I used to want to be remembered for something big," he said. "Now I just want to be faithful with whatever's in my hands." Grace nodded. Faithfulness is the new greatness. That night she wrote in her journal, something she hadn't done in years. Not a story, not a poem, just a truth. God does not need the strong to accomplish the impossible. He only needs the willing. And she was willing. The next morning, a surprise came in the form of a letter. It was from a nonprofit across the country. They had heard about the Anchor. Someone who had stayed there had written to them, not asking for help, but sharing their testimony. The letter ended with a single sentence. "If you want to see real ministry, visit the Anchor." And so they did. 2 weeks later, a representative flew in, walked through the halls, spoke with the residents, watched Grace hold hands with Lila during one of her quiet spells, watched David carry groceries, then pause to pray with a trembling teenager who had just arrived. The visitor didn't say much during the tour, but before leaving, they turned to Grace. "You're doing what most can't." Grace shook her head. "We're doing what most forget matters." 2 months later, the Anchor received an anonymous donation, enough to fund 2 more homes. Grace wept when she saw the amount. Not because of the money, but because it meant more places, more chairs at the table, more lives touched by something that had started in the dust of the street. She and David spent weeks praying over the locations. They didn't want to rush. They didn't want to replicate. They wanted to remain rooted in the very heart that started it all. "Whatever we build," David said, "let it always feel like a hand held out." And it did. Each new house bore the same spirit. Not just comfort, but conviction. Not just shelter, but sacred space. A place for the bruised and the brave. A place where tears were not weakness. Where silence was honored. Where stories were not judged by their beginnings. And at the entrance of every new house, Grace had a single phrase carved into the wood. "This is holy ground." Because she knew now, what many still forget. God restores through the unlikely, through women who have nothing left to lose, through men who have fallen too many times to count, through bread broken on a sidewalk, through kindness mocked by the world, but honored by heaven. And as long as her hands could hold the weight of another soul's sorrow, she would keep showing up, not to be seen, not to be praised, but to be useful. Because when God restores, He does not just fix what's broken, He redefines what beauty means altogether. It had begun with a piece of bread, nothing extraordinary, half of a sandwich, a napkin, a quiet woman who had once been invisible herself, and a man on the edge of forgetting he mattered. No camera had been invited to that moment. No headline predicted what would follow. No one had expected anything to grow from that crack in the sidewalk where hope had quietly been passed from hand to hand. But heaven had. Because heaven doesn't look for grandeur. It looks for obedience, for love in motion, for compassion that does not ask for applause. And so from that simple exchange, one piece of bread, one look of dignity, a miracle had begun to bloom. Not quickly, not loudly, but deeply, like roots pressing into the unseen. Years passed, and the anchor stood firm, not because it was large, but because it was loved. And those who came through its doors left traces behind, not of burden, but of belonging. There was the woman who stayed only 3 nights, but left behind a painting of an open gate, her own way of saying, "Thank you for letting me in." There was the young boy who returned, 10 years after he first sat at their table, now a social worker, now bringing others to that same door. There was the handwritten letter that arrived from overseas. No name, just, "I once stood in the rain outside your home. I never came in, but I saw your light, and it saved me." And there was Grace. Still there, still faithful, still lighting candles when the sun dipped low, still folding laundry with hands that remembered what it was like to be overlooked, still walking slowly through the garden, whispering names in prayer as her fingers brushed against thyme, basil, and marigold. She never took credit. She never claimed ownership. She said only, "I'm just holding what God gave me." And David, older now, gentler, still beside her. Their love had not become a performance. It had become a home, one made of glances, of shared silence, of a shoulder offered without needing to ask. They grew older in grace, side by side. No vows on paper, but something deeper than contract. A covenant of presence, of "I see you," of "I stay." On their 5th anniversary, they held no event. They served soup, bread, water in mismatched mugs, and after the meal, Grace stood at the kitchen sink and whispered once again, "Thank you," because it had never been about the magnitude of the moment. It had been about faithfulness in the small, and that faithfulness had not returned void. Later that night, under the stars, she wrote in her journal. It was the same one she had begun on the day they opened the first anchor home. Her hands shook more now, but her heart was steady. She wrote, "Sometimes the bread you share is the seed of a miracle you didn't know you needed. Sometimes the moment you think is small is the very doorway heaven was waiting to open. Sometimes love looks like loss. Sometimes it looks like laundry. But always, always, it changes something." She closed the book, placed it gently beside her Bible, and sat quietly for a long time. David joined her. They said little. The years had taught them not to fill silence with noise, only presence. Eventually he turned to her. "You ever think about how none of this would have happened if you hadn't stopped?" Grace looked at him, smiled gently. "I think about it every day. You didn't hesitate. I did, in my heart. For half a second. I heard the voice of caution, the voice of fear, but Grace spoke louder." He nodded. "It usually does." They sat together until the night grew heavy, until the lights in the house were out, until the last candle flickered low. Then, just before they rose to go in, Grace looked up. The stars were impossibly clear, and she whispered, "Let it always stay this quiet. Not the place, the soul," because she knew the world would continue to rush. It would mock tenderness. It would worship noise. But here, in this sacred rhythm of compassion, something eternal had taken root. And every loaf of bread, every bowl of soup, every quiet prayer whispered over folded laundry, had not gone unseen. Not by God, not by those who had been touched, not by the generations who would one day come to the anchor not knowing its full story, but feeling its peace. Because sometimes what you plant is not for you to harvest. Sometimes the seed you bury in mercy becomes the forest someone else walks through in healing. And sometimes the bread you share is the very answer to a prayer you didn't know you had been praying all your life. Years later, after Grace had passed on, softly, in sleep, with peace in every line of her face, people came. Dozens, then hundreds. Some had stayed a night, some had stayed a year. Some had only passed by, receiving a warm word and a muffin at the gate. They came to remember, to honor, to testify. And as they spoke one by one, the same words echoed in different forms. She saw me. She didn't flinch. She believed I still had a name. David stood among them. No speech written, no robe, no title. Just a man whose life had been rebuilt by a woman who offered her lunch on a forgotten street. And when his turn came to speak, he said only this: Grace didn't change the world, she changed mine. And that changed everything. The room fell silent, a holy quiet. Then, from the back, a small voice spoke. She changed mine too, and another, until the quiet became a choir of remembrance, of resurrection, of the sacred truth that the kingdom of God grows in mustard seeds and meals served at dusk. And that, yes, sometimes the miracle is not in the healing. It is in the hand that never stops offering bread. That afternoon, no one knew it would be Grace's last walk through the garden. She moved slowly now. Her steps were measured, deliberate, yet unburdened by regret. There was no heaviness in her eyes, only the soft calm of someone who had poured her life out like water and had not run dry. The air was warm, the earth fragrant, the rosemary blooming at her feet. She paused beside the olive tree they had planted years before, touched the bark and closed her eyes. She whispered a name, not hers, not David's, but a name only heaven and Grace knew. She smiled, turned back toward the house. She wasn't tired, not of the work, not of the love, not of the people, but her soul was full, and fullness, when sacred, sometimes signals that it is time to go. Inside, the house breathed with quiet rhythm. The scent of fresh bread filled the air. Grace had baked one last loaf that morning. She had wrapped it carefully, set it on the table with a note. For whoever needs it most today, love, Grace. Then, without a word to anyone, she went to her room. She sat in her chair by the window, the one that caught the best light in the afternoon. She looked outside, and with her Bible in her lap and a smile still resting on her lips, she closed her eyes and returned home. No fear, no fanfare, only peace. A stillness that felt like breath held by the earth itself. The news spread gently, as if the world itself had agreed to speak of her softly. There was no public announcement, no social media post, no great performance. Only quiet phone calls, whispers through the halls. Tears, not of devastation, but of reverence. David was the one who found the note. He didn't cry right away. He simply sat beside it, touched the cloth, read her handwriting over and over, and then he lit a candle. The next day the chapel was full, but not loud. No black clothes, no heavy music. Instead they wore the colors Grace had loved. Soft blues, garden greens, grays that looked like rain before spring. The ceremony wasn't led by a pastor, it was led by the people. One by one they stood, not to eulogize but to testify. A woman with silver hair said, "She made me believe God hadn't given up on me." A teenager said, "She saw me when I didn't know how to see myself." A young mother whispered, "She prayed over my unborn daughter. That girl is 7 now, and every year we light a candle and say thank you." Troy, no longer the boy they once knew, but a man, stood and read Psalm 34. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed. And then David. He didn't walk to the front. He stayed seated, held a loaf of bread in his lap, the last one she had baked. He said, "She gave me bread when the world gave me silence." He paused, then added, "And God gave me her." No one moved. No one breathed. Because in those few words, everything was said. Afterward, people lingered. No one wanted to leave. They sat on the porch, on the grass, in the hallways. They cried, yes, but they also laughed. They remembered her laugh, her hands, the way she tilted her head when she listened, the way she never rushed. That night, David sat in the garden alone. The rosemary swayed in the wind. He opened her Bible, ran his fingers across the margins where she had underlined, "You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me." He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you," because he knew this wasn't the end. The next morning, a young woman arrived at the anchor. She had no luggage, only a notebook, and eyes full of hesitation. She stood at the gate, unsure. One of the volunteers approached and opened the door. "You're welcome here," she said. The woman stepped inside, breath catching as the smell of bread greeted her. She didn't know Grace. She didn't know the stories. But she felt something settle in her spirit, something that felt like exhale. A week later, she stayed. And one day, she asked about the woman in the photo in the front room. They told her. Not everything. Just enough. They told her about the sidewalk, the sandwich, the garden, the silence, the candles. They didn't speak of legacy. They spoke of presence, of obedience, of love that expects nothing yet leaves everything changed. She nodded. And that night, she lit her first candle. A month later, a letter arrived from a woman named Clara. She had opened another home. She called it bread and light. In her words, "Because Grace fed me when I didn't know I was starving, and gave me light when all I knew was dark." Etched on the entry wall were the words, "She didn't feed a man. She fed the beginning of a miracle." And the miracle wasn't just the anchor. It wasn't just Clara's house. It wasn't even the lives changed. It was this: that love, when planted without pride, never dies. It multiplies, it grows silently, and it returns, always. She didn't feed just a hungry man. She fed her own faith. She planted what the world thought was small, and heaven made it sacred. She didn't know she was building a legacy. She thought she was offering lunch. But sometimes, the smallest act becomes the seed of everything. And if I told you that in another story, a woman was paid to carry a stranger's child, but what was born was something no one could have imagined. Watch now. He paid a homeless woman to bear his child. Then came the unthinkable, because once again, what looked wrong to the world was used by God to touch hearts forever.